My name is Helen Vance, and I just turned 18 years old, standing on the precipice of a brand new chapter of my life, while the echoes of a meticulously orchestrated deception still hung heavy in the air. At my birthday celebration last night, surrounded by glittering silver decorations and the hollow laughter of people who claimed to care for me, my father pulled me aside near the dessert table and spoke in a low, conspiratorial voice. "When this whole ordeal is over," he told me, "you are going to sign some standard paperwork for Uncle Julian," casually dismissing it as just a formality that required no real thought or hesitation. I forced a smile, nodded along with his instructions, and played the obedient, unsuspecting daughter they all expected me to be. Then I calmly walked away from the crowd, slipped into the quiet kitchen, opened my laptop, and transferred my entire inheritance from my maternal grandparents directly into an irrevocable trust, just in case things went sideways. The following morning, my parents and my younger sister Chloe discovered the unvarnished truth of what I had done. The secluded lakeside cabin, the accumulated savings, and the valuable investments were completely shielded behind an impenetrable legal wall that they could not touch or manipulate. My father went visibly pale when he realized his grand scheme had collapsed, while my uncle, who had already greedily signed a binding contract to sell property he never legally owned, frantically called a defense lawyer. Before I lay bare the dramatic sequence of events that unfolded next, let me take you back 6 transformative years to when the seeds of this entire conflict were first planted. The summer I turned 12, my grandfather picked me up in his battered old pickup truck and drove me out to Whispering Pines, a secluded sanctuary nestled beside a sprawling, glass-like lake. The rustic cabin sat quietly behind towering pine trees, its wooden porch leaning slightly to one side and a screen door that never quite managed to close right, no matter how hard you pulled it. The entire place carried a comforting aroma of wood smoke, weathered old books, and something sweet and indescribable that always felt like home. "Grab the other end," Grandpa said, while effortlessly lifting a heavy wooden fence rail, and without hesitation, I grabbed it, spending the entire morning alongside him fixing rotten fence posts under the warm summer sun. Grandpa never rushed me or made me feel inadequate. Instead, he patiently showed me how to press my thumb firmly into the timber to test if the core was weak and compromised. "If the wood gives in under pressure," he told me with a knowing look, "then it's done for and needs replacing." Inside the cabin, Grandma Clara always had warm sandwiches and freshly brewed iced tea waiting patiently on the handmade wooden kitchen table that Grandpa had built entirely with his own calloused hands. That same evening, we sat together on the creaky front porch and watched the tranquil lake turn a brilliant shade of gold as the sun dipped below the tree line. "This cabin stays safely in the family," Grandpa told me in a quiet, solemn tone. "But remember, Helen, family isn't always just about shared blood. Family is whoever truly shows up for you when it matters most." At 12 years old, I naively thought he was just being poetic and speaking in riddles. But as the years progressed, I realized how profoundly right he was. From that summer onward, I spent almost every single weekend at Whispering Pines, immersing myself in the rhythm of the woods and the warmth of my grandparents' presence. Grandpa eagerly taught me how to fix persistent roof leaks, patch weathered screens, and check the structural integrity of the cabin, while Grandma Clara showed me how to meticulously organize their massive collection of books by color, because it made the entire room feel warmer and more inviting. They showed me every hidden corner and functional part of that beloved cabin, as if they were slowly handing me the delicate pieces of a deeply guarded secret. Back home in our suburban house in Oak Ridge, things felt starkly different and emotionally detached. Our house was fine on the surface, but it lacked any genuine warmth or emotional resonance. My younger sister Chloe enjoyed the larger bedroom, complete with lavender walls and expensive designer furniture, while my own room still featured worn, threadbare carpet left behind by the previous owners. One evening, during a tense family dinner, Dad casually brought up the subject of the lakeside property while cutting into his expensive steak. "Dad's place out at the lake is steadily losing market value," he remarked dismissively, "so we should really sell it off and reinvest the capital into something more lucrative." Mom nodded in agreement, chiming in that it made complete financial sense. Grandpa explicitly said the cabin stays in the family, I interjected quietly, trying to defend the memory of my grandfather's wishes. Dad let out a short, dismissive laugh, not a mean one, but a condescending chuckle that stung deeply. You were only 12 years old, Helen, he brushed me off, and he was just being nice to a kid. The conversation then swiftly moved on to celebrate Chloe's latest debate trophy, completely ignoring the science fair ribbon I had proudly won just 2 weeks earlier. After dinner was cleared away, I noticed a glossy real estate flyer left abandoned on the kitchen counter, advertising premier lakefront lots and exorbitant development prices, with a handwritten phone number scribbled aggressively on the margin. Someone was already circling my grandparents' sanctuary like a vulture and seeing nothing but dollar signs. 2 years later, Grandpa Harold passed away unexpectedly when I was just 14 years old. Standing near the dessert table at his somber funeral reception, I accidentally overheard Dad and Uncle Julian whispering conspiratorially. We really need to move forward on liquidating this before the probate process gets unnecessarily complicated, Julian muttered under his breath, while clutching a thick manila folder under his arm. They were actively scheming to sell off the cabin before the floral arrangements at my grandfather's grave had even begun to wither. Yet I forced myself to stay completely silent because I was only a teenager, and had no idea that my grandfather had already meticulously planned for this exact predatory moment. 2 years slipped by in a blur of mounting tension, and then Grandma Clara fell seriously ill in March and peacefully passed away in June. The final time I visited her in the hospital before the end, she gripped my frail hand with surprising strength. "The cabin belongs to you now, Helen," she whispered hoarsely with her final breaths, "and you must never let them take it away from you, I promise." She squeezed my hand once more and gently closed her eyes. Following her emotional funeral service, Dad sat at the kitchen table looking remarkably relieved rather than grief-stricken. "Now we can finally sort out this property mess and move on," he announced cheerfully. That very night, I stood in the dark hallway holding a glass of water and overheard him scheming with Julian in the garage, urging him to get things moving quickly. To me, Grandma's passing felt like an irreplaceable emotional catastrophe, but to them, it was merely an overdue business opportunity. I did not waste my energy crying that night. Instead, I made a resolute decision that would alter the course of my life. From the age of 16 until my 18th birthday, the cabin at Whispering Pines became my quiet, determined sanctuary of rebellion. Every single Saturday morning, I drove out to the lake in an old, reliable hatchback I had purchased entirely with my own hard-earned babysitting money. I spent my weekends industriously fixing torn window screens, sweeping heavy layers of pine needles off the aging roof, and carefully repairing deteriorating weather stripping to keep the elements at bay. Back at our family home, however, the linguistic landscape began to shift dramatically. The cabin stopped being referred to as Grandpa's place. Instead, it was now constantly discussed as the family property, a communal asset ripe for exploitation. Uncle Julian started visiting our house with increasing frequency, sometimes carrying thick folders and other times brandishing formal real estate documents ready for execution. One evening, I finally reached my breaking point and spoke up at the dinner table, reminding them that Grandma explicitly wanted me to keep it. Mom gently put down her fork, looked at me with feigned pity, and remarked that my grandmother had simply been too emotional near the end, declaring that the situation was purely business, nothing more, nothing less. That cold corporate word quickly became their convenient excuse for everything selfish they did. By the time I reached 17, Dad became much more brazen and direct in his intentions, telling me that the moment I turned 18, they would finally settle the property matter as a family. Yet, the way he pronounced the word family made my stomach violently twist into knots. One sunlit afternoon while doing routine maintenance at the cabin, I discovered a hidden envelope tucked securely behind a stack of antique quilts in the bedroom closet. My full name was carefully written across the front in neat block letters, and when I opened it, I found a crisp, professional business card belonging to Margaret Caldwell, attorney at law. Below her name were 4 small, life-changing words: Twain Family Trust. My hand shook uncontrollably as the reality washed over me. Grandma had secretly set this up for me to find when the time was right. 3 months ahead of my milestone 18th birthday, Margaret called my cell phone and requested a private meeting, stating that we needed to speak urgently before I legally reached adulthood. That following Saturday, I met her at her downtown office, which carried a comforting scent of freshly brewed coffee and aged paper. She opened a thick leather folder, looked directly into my eyes, and delivered the news that my grandparents had quietly established an irrevocable trust 6 full years prior, placing the cabin, the family savings, and various investments safely inside it with a total estimated value of over $2 million. "You are the designated sole beneficiary," she continued, as the room seemed to tilt beneath my feet, "and the property was legally transferred out of my family's reach years ago. Your father and uncle possess zero legal claim to it whatsoever." Puzzled, I asked why they hadn't been informed, and Margaret explained that my grandfather had explicitly instructed her, knowing full well that his greedy sons would attempt to sell off the property before his memorial flowers even wilted. To make matters worse, she warned me that someone had recently been aggressively poking around county offices, asking suspicious questions about the property title. Following that eye-opening meeting, I began paying extremely close attention to my family's private conversations. One Sunday evening, Julian came over for an unannounced dinner, and afterward, he and Dad retreated to the garage to talk strategy. Standing near the cracked wooden door, I strained to listen as Julian boasted that he had already signed a binding purchase agreement with Ridgeline Development for the sum of $450,000. My chest tightened into a painful knot as I heard Dad ask how they planned to clean up the title discrepancy, to which Julian coolly replied that they would simply file a quitclaim deed since Mom and Dad were technically out of the picture and they considered themselves the primary legal heirs. When Dad anxiously asked what about me since I was still 17 and might object, Julian laughed heartlessly, suggesting they simply toss me 50 grand for college and demanding I should be utterly grateful for the scraps. I stepped away from the door with ice-cold hands, realizing that my uncle had already brazenly promised to sell a piece of land he did not even legally own. That very night, I texted Margaret to let her know they were accelerating their timeline, and her reassuring reply came back almost instantly. The very next Saturday, Margaret carefully laid out the final legal steps, explaining that the exact second I turned 18, I would automatically become the legal successor beneficiary with full executive control. "The moment you sign the paperwork," she assured me, "I will personally file a formal legal notice at the county recorder's office first thing Monday morning, ensuring nobody will ever be able to sell the property out from under you." When I nervously asked what would happen if they tried anyway, she smiled calmly and said they would fail completely. Looking down at the stack of legal documents, I considered whether I should warn my parents, but Margaret slowly removed her glasses and reminded me that my grandfather had hired her to protect me, not to negotiate with thieves. 9 days ahead of my birthday, Dad gleefully announced that he was throwing me a massive, lavish birthday celebration, smiling broadly and declaring that you only turn 18 once in a lifetime. I forced a convincing smile back at him, knowing the grim reality behind his hospitality. My father was planning my birthday party. My uncle was actively planning to steal my beloved cabin, and I was quietly waiting for both of them to walk right into a legal trap my grandparents had constructed years in advance. 5 days before the milestone date, Mom sat beside me on the couch with a soft, manipulative expression, gently suggesting that now that I was on the threshold of adulthood, we should make some major family decisions together. That comforting word, together, felt utterly hollow and toxic on her lips. She argued that the cabin cost a fortune in mounting taxes, endless repairs, and steep insurance premiums, and claimed that selling it would allow them to clear their crippling debts and provide financial support for both me and my sister Chloe. When I reminded her that Grandma specifically wanted me to keep it, Mom's carefully maintained patience slipped for a fraction of a second, as she snapped that sentiment doesn't pay the bills. Dad conveniently walked into the room at that exact psychological moment, proudly announcing that he had already talked to a prospective buyer from Ridgeline Development. I feigned ignorance, muttered that I would think about it, and Dad patted my shoulder, calling me his favorite girl. Later that night, Chloe crept into my bedroom in her pajamas and whispered that she kept overhearing Mom and Dad talking excitedly about the cabin after they thought she was asleep, asking if something bad was happening. I gently tucked the cozy blanket around her feet, told her not to worry about adult problems, though she still looked troubled in the dim light. 3 days before my birthday, Uncle Julian ambushed me in the driveway with a slick, predatory salesman smile plastered across his face. "The land alone is worth $450,000, he pressured me aggressively, telling me that if I just said yes, I would walk away with $50,000 in cash and let them handle the rest. His forced smile tightened dangerously as he condescendingly reminded me that I was young and that $50,000 was a lot of money for a teenager. Gathering my courage, I asked him whose name was currently listed on the official deed, to which he dismissively replied that it belonged to my grandparents, but since they were gone, the old rules no longer applied. I calmly told him that was fundamentally not how property ownership works, and for a terrifying split second, his polite mask slipped entirely before he quickly forced the fake smile back into place and told me not to overthink things. The second he drove away from our house, I watched him pull out his phone to call my father, and I knew precisely what was coming next. On the night before my milestone birthday, I drove out to Whispering Pines alone under the cover of darkness. The lake was completely dark, silent, and mesmerizingly still. I sat down in Grandpa's favorite wooden porch chair, opened Margaret's encrypted email on my laptop, and reviewed all the legal acceptance papers that were finally ready for my signature. At the stroke of midnight, I read every single clause twice, closed the laptop screen, and listened to the gentle lapping of the water against the shore. Grandpa had once taught me that patience was never a sign of weakness, but rather a profound understanding of perfect timing. And sitting there in the cool night air, I finally understood the depth of his wisdom. The tears finally fell quietly down my cheeks, not because I felt defeated or weak, but because I desperately wished circumstances were different, wishing my father cared more about family bonds than inflated property values, wishing my mother had valued my desires, and wishing I didn't need a wall of legal documents to shield myself from my own flesh and blood. But wishes have never won a complex legal battle. Ironclad documents do. I drove back home and deliberately set my bedside alarm for 11:45 p.m., knowing that at midnight I would legally cross the threshold into adulthood and everything would fundamentally change. At precisely 11:50 p.m., the house was entirely dead to the world, and I initiated a private video call with Margaret to finalize the transition. "Ready?" she asked quietly across the screen, and as the glowing digital clock officially struck midnight, I digitally signed the official acceptance papers. Just like that, I officially became the legal successor beneficiary of the multi-million-dollar tween family trust. Margaret instructed me that her first order of business at 8 o'clock in the morning would be filing the official legal notice at the county records office so that no one could ever touch the property again, reassuring me with absolute certainty that this wasn't some dirty trick, but rather my grandparents' final protective gift. Downstairs in their comfortable beds, my family slept peacefully, entirely oblivious to the fact that Uncle Julian's forged paperwork was already completely worthless. That very same night, Julian sat in his apartment frantically printing out fraudulent notary stamps and forged signatures, calling Dad around 11:30 p.m. to assure him that everything was primed and ready for their morning courthouse visit. Though Dad sounded slightly nervous on the end of the line, asking if he was certain this would fly, Julian arrogantly brushed off his concerns as a simple property transfer between rightful heirs. However, it was far from simple. Julian had already locked himself into a binding commercial contract with Ridgeline Development, and if he failed to produce clean ownership credentials by morning, he would instantly owe them crippling breach of contract penalties. He had recklessly gambled everything on a piece of real estate he had never bothered to properly verify, and by sunrise, he was about to receive a devastating education in reality. My 18th birthday party kicked off at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, filling our living room with well-meaning neighbors, church acquaintances, and distant relatives who brought cheerful balloons, festive wrapping paper, and silver decorations. I played my part brilliantly, smiling, chatting, and politely opening gifts while harboring the small, life-altering document tucked safely inside the inner pocket of my jacket. Dad stood proudly near the tiered birthday cake, raised his glass high into the air, and announced to the gathered room that I was officially an adult today, and that our family had exceptionally exciting plans for the future, looking directly at me with an expectant grin as he asked if I agreed. Every single face in the room turned toward me in unison, and I simply offered a polite nod and a quiet thanks, refusing to give anything away. Later in the afternoon, Nora Beckett, a kind elderly woman who lived next door to our cabin at the lake, quietly pulled me aside near the punch bowl and whispered that she had spotted my uncle snooping around our property the previous week, accompanied by 2 men in expensive suits who were aggressively measuring the land and taking notes for prospective buyers. After the cake was finally served to the guests, Dad stood up once again, clearing his throat to capture everyone's attention. "Our family has recently struggled through some difficult financial patches," he announced loudly to the stunned room. "But thankfully, Harold and Clara left us a very valuable asset, the historic cabin at Cedar Lake." The living room instantly fell dead silent as he continued, stating that as a collective family unit, they had officially decided to sell it off. "We've decided," he emphasized proudly, waiting for the applause that never came, smiling warmly at me as he claimed that Iris fully understands this is what's best for everyone's future. I slowly and deliberately set down my fork on the ceramic plate, looked him dead in the eye, and announced clearly that I had never once agreed to sell the cabin. Dad's confident smile instantly froze into a mask of pure panic, and he laughed nervously, trying to wave it off by telling the guests that I was just joking around. I stood my ground, staring at him without blinking, and stated firmly that I was not joking in the slightest. Uncle Julian abruptly stepped forward, his face flushing red as he hissed that this was entirely the wrong time and place to air family business. I looked at him with absolute calm and told him he was entirely right, noting that the appropriate time for these matters was precisely 8 a.m. the following morning at the county office. A suffocating silence blanketed the room as the guests exchanged bewildered glances, though Julian suddenly looked physically ill and deeply unnerved. Within minutes, the party swiftly dissolved as awkward guests grabbed their coats and made hasty exits, leaving the house empty and vibrating with suppressed fury. The second the front door clicked shut, Mom whirled around and rounded on me with venomous anger, snapping at me to see what kind of immense stress I was putting my father through. "He could literally lose our primary home," she shrieked hysterically, "and here you are selfishly trying to sabotage your grandmother's legacy over childish sentiment. We are a family," she screamed at the top of her lungs, "and if you genuinely loved this family, you wouldn't need to hide behind a lawyer." I froze in my tracks, my blood running cold as I demanded to know how she knew anything about a lawyer, realizing instantly that my mother was incapable of offering a coherent defense. Instead, her guilty expression admitted the horrifying truth. Uncle Julian had brazenly ransacked my personal school bag earlier in the week and stolen Margaret's hidden business card. Before I could hurl my righteous fury back at them, Nora Beckett forcefully stepped back into the kitchen from the hallway, her expression stern and unyielding. "That young lady has every absolute right to consult with an attorney to protect her interests," she stated firmly, glaring directly at my mother. Mom shrieked that this was strictly private family business, but Nora refused to back down an inch, reminding them sharply that Clara would have wanted her granddaughter protected from vultures like them. The second Nora finally left the house, Dad slammed the heavy kitchen door shut, making the entire room feel claustrophobic and menacing. "Here's the exact way this is going to play out," Dad threatened slowly, his voice laced with dangerous finality. "Tomorrow morning, without fail, we file the required paperwork, the cabin sells to Ridgeline, and you walk away with $50,000 in your pocket." When I demanded to know the total valuation of the sale, out of which I was only receiving scraps, neither of them answered. And what happens if I stubbornly refuse to sign? I challenged, watching his face harden into stone. Then you are entirely on your own in this world, he barked, promising zero financial help for college and revocation of your right to live under this roof. The cruelty of his ultimatum hurt far deeper than I ever could have anticipated, but I forced my spine to straighten. You are actively threatening to kick your own daughter out into the streets just to cash in on a stolen legacy, I pointed out with quiet devastation. I am merely asking you to be a loyal part of this family, he deflected defensively. I stood up tall, looked him straight in the eye, and whispered that I was indeed a proud part of this family, specifically the part that actually knew how to keep a solemn promise, before turning my back and walking upstairs to my bedroom for the night. At precisely 8 a.m. the very next morning, the county recorder's office doors swung open, and Margaret Caldwell was the very first person through the threshold, efficiently handing over the airtight trust documentation and formally filing the binding legal notice against the cabin property. Done and dusted. From that exact second onward, any prospective buyer or county official checking the public title records would instantly see the undeniable truth. The cabin belonged exclusively to the irrevocable trust, and I was its sole legal beneficiary. At 8:14 a.m., my phone buzzed on the kitchen table, where I sat calmly eating a bowl of cereal, and Margaret's voice came through, confirming that everything was successfully completed. A few moments later, Dad and Uncle Julian clattered down the stairs, dressed in their expensive business suits, looking eager and smug. We will be back by lunchtime with the deal locked down, Dad announced brightly while aggressively jingling his car keys. I took a slow sip of my milk and looked up with absolute serenity, wishing them good luck. At 9:05 a.m., Uncle Julian confidently slid his fraudulent quitclaim deed across the counter to the county clerk, who briskly typed the property identification number into her computer terminal before abruptly freezing in her tracks. I am terribly sorry, but I cannot legally record this document, the clerk stated matter-of-factly. Julian blinked in utter confusion, asking what she meant, and Dad stepped forward demanding clarification. The property is legally owned in its entirety by the Twain Family Irrevocable Trust, and has been for the past 6 consecutive years, the clerk responded calmly, landing the fatal blow by adding that a formal legal notice had also been officially recorded against the title just hours earlier that morning. Julian's face drained of every drop of color until he looked like a ghost, and Dad slowly pivoted on his heel to stare at him in mounting horror. You explicitly promised me this was a simple, foolproof transfer, Dad hissed under his breath. I genuinely had no idea about any trust existing, Julian stammered frantically. You are a licensed professional real estate agent by trade, Dad roared at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing off the tile walls. How on earth did you fail to check basic title history? Sitting quietly in the public waiting area a few feet away, Margaret observed the entire glorious meltdown unfold without uttering a single word, because she didn't need to say anything at all. At 9:22 a.m., my phone rang aggressively, and I answered to hear Dad's screaming demands through the receiver, demanding to know what catastrophic sabotage I had pulled. I simply accepted the legitimate inheritance that my grandparents lovingly left behind for me, I replied evenly. You went completely behind our backs and conspired with a slick lawyer behind our family's back, he accused hysterically. Dad, I said softly, cutting through his panic. That lawyer has been quietly involved in protecting this estate for 6 whole years. You simply chose never to ask the right questions because greed blinded you. A heavy, suffocating silence suffocated the phone line for a long, agonizing moment. This was supposed to be my parents' sacred property, he whispered hoarsely, choking on his own realization, and they explicitly chose me to protect it. Not because they didn't love you as their son, I countered gently, but because they inherently knew they could never trust you with it. With a violent click, Dad abruptly hung up the phone in utter despair. Barely a few minutes had passed before Ridgeline Development's corporate legal counsel aggressively called my number, their attorney sounding intensely frustrated and hostile. We hold a fully executed, binding purchase contract signed by Julian Tane for this property, the lawyer demanded aggressively. Well, Mr. Taine does not own the property and never did, I replied calmly. There was a long, stunned pause on the line before the corporate lawyer quietly asked if the cabin was open for private purchase on the open market, to which I firmly answered no before terminating the call. That very same afternoon, Margaret delivered even more catastrophic news when she informed me that the notary stamp utilized on Julian's fraudulent paperwork had been definitively flagged as a complete fabrication. My stomach dropped into my shoes as I asked if that meant it was a serious criminal offense, and Margaret confirmed grimly that my uncle had not merely attempted to engage in shady civil theft, but had actively committed multiple federal felonies of forgery and fraud. Dad arrived back at our suburban house around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, looking utterly hollowed out and physically exhausted, while Mom had clearly spent the entire morning weeping uncontrollably in the kitchen. Dad slumped into a chair across from me at the kitchen table and confessed in a broken whisper that his commercial bank was aggressively coming after him for an immediate liquidity repayment of $180,000, admitting that his supply store business was officially gone for good and that liquidating the family cabin had been his desperate, last-ditch effort to save them from total bankruptcy. I looked across the table and told him honestly that I was deeply sorry for the collapse of his business, but firmly reminded him that the cabin was never his property to sell in the first place. Mom jumped into the conversation, desperate to shift blame, claiming that my grandparents simply hadn't been thinking clearly or acting rationally near the very end of their lives. They created this airtight trust 6 full years before they drew their final breaths, I reminded them coldly, prompting Dad to slam his heavy hand down onto the wooden table in a fit of impotent rage, swearing that he would legally contest the trust in court until his last dime was gone. Before the echo of his threat could fade, Margaret's professional voice came through clearly on my phone speaker, as I had instinctively kept her on standby. "Mr. Taine," she addressed him with chilling calm, "initiating a legal battle to contest this trust will effortlessly cost you vastly more in legal fees than the physical value of the property itself, because this trust was structured by masters to be entirely airtight from top to bottom." Dad stared at me across the kitchen table, and for the very first time in my entire life, I saw something completely foreign flash in his eyes. Not burning anger or righteous indignation, but total, unadulterated defeat. Barely 2 hours later, Uncle Julian called our landline in a state of absolute panic, because Ridgeline Development was aggressively slapping him with a massive, multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit for fraudulent misrepresentation and heavy breach of contract, his voice cracking uncontrollably as he babbled that they were accusing him of deliberate fraud. Dad's response over the speaker was chillingly cold and devoid of any familial loyalty. "Did you or did you not commit outright fraud, Julian?" "I honestly thought we owned the land fair and square," Julian whimpered, to which Dad fired back that he was a professional real estate agent who should have known better than to skip basic title verification. A sickening silence hung in the air before Julian broke down and confessed the final damning truth, that he had illegally manufactured a fake notary stamp to push the sale through. Dad inhaled a sharp, ragged breath, realizing the gravity of the crime, and whispered that Julian's forgery had crossed a line from which there was no return, stating flatly that he needed a criminal defense attorney immediately, just like he did. Over the course of the next few agonizing weeks, the entire fabricated facade of our family life completely disintegrated around us. Ridgeline Development relentlessly pursued Julian through the courts, forcing the county to open a formal criminal investigation into the fake notary stamps, which swiftly resulted in the immediate suspension and permanent revocation of Julian's real estate license. Gossip spread through our small town like wildfire, not because I went out of my way to maliciously spread rumors, but simply because municipal court dockets are a matter of public record for anyone to read. Soon, every neighbor, store clerk, and acquaintance in town knew the sensational story of how Harold Twain's greedy sons had attempted to illegally steal his beloved sanctuary, only to be stopped dead in their tracks by his teenage granddaughter. While some locals whispered that I was remarkably brave and steadfast, others judged me harshly and called me cold-hearted. but I refused to waste my precious energy arguing with either side of the peanut gallery. One afternoon, a desperate Julian called my phone directly, begging and pleading for me to instruct my high-priced attorney to lift the crippling legal notice so he could somehow salvage the collapsed real estate deal and fix his ruined life. "The legal notice stays exactly where it is," I told him firmly, reminding him that his own parents would be utterly ashamed of the criminal path he chose to walk. When he snarled that I had no heart, I looked across my bedroom desk at Grandpa's framed black and white photograph and replied quietly that my grandparents are the exact reason this protective trust exists in the first place, because they anticipated this exact betrayal and chose to stop it before it could destroy me. He let out a pathetic sob and slammed the phone down in my ear. Dad eventually abandoned his futile legal posturing, selling off his struggling building supply store at a devastating financial loss, and working out a humiliating multi-year debt repayment plan with his commercial lenders. Mom was forced to swallow her pride and return to the workforce, taking a humbling job standing on her feet all day as a cashier at a local pharmacy, while our suburban family house was kept afloat by a thread for barely 2 weeks before the reality of their downsizing set in. The domestic silence inside our home grew so heavy and oppressive you could practically cut it with a knife, and Dad and I barely exchanged more than a few monosyllabic words a day. One evening, my younger sister Chloe called me from a friend's house, her voice trembling slightly over the cellular connection, as she confessed that while she didn't understand the complex legal nuances of everything that had transpired, she was genuinely heartbroken that our parents had treated me so poorly. My throat tightened with suppressed emotion as I thanked her, telling her that Kelsey meant the world to me. In late April, as the harsh winter finally thawed into vibrant spring, I drove my hatchback back out to Whispering Pines for the first time since the legal dust had settled. The massive pine trees bordering the glistening lake were bursting with fresh blooms and vibrant green needles, and I unlocked the front door using the very same weathered brass key my grandfather had handed me years earlier. The cabin interior smelled precisely the same as it always had, a rich, comforting blend of pine resin, aged paperback issues, and sun-warmed timber. I wandered slowly through every single room, running my fingertips across the sturdy kitchen table Grandpa had built with his own hands, admiring Grandma's neatly organized, color-coded bookshelves, and stepping out onto the creaky front porch, where we had spent countless golden hours watching the sun sink below the water. While inspecting the antique writing desk in the corner, I discovered another hidden envelope tucked deep inside the bottom drawer, bearing my name written across the front in my grandfather's distinct, shaky handwriting. Inside was a deeply personal, handwritten letter that completely unraveled my emotional composure. He wrote that while he deeply loved both of his sons, they had tragically spent their entire lives failing to comprehend the fundamental difference between something that possesses a superficial monetary price tag and something that is genuinely, intrinsically valuable to the soul. Then came the single sentence that completely broke my emotional defenses. "I chose you to inherit this place, my girl, because you were the only one who ever looked at a rotting roof and asked if it needed fixing, before you ever had the audacity to ask what the property was worth on the open market." At the very bottom of the page, he left a final piece of advice telling me to take good care of the cabin, because it would take care of me first when the world grew cold. I sat out on that quiet porch chair for hours after reading those words, letting the gentle breeze wash over my face as the sun slowly climbed higher into the sky. A week later, Margaret called with another piece of life-altering news, announcing that the formal legal notice could now be permanently transitioned since the title was fully secure and untouchable, and noting that Uncle Julian had finally managed to settle his crippling debts with Ridgeline Development by taking out a massive, life-ruining personal loan that would take him decades to pay off, officially bringing an end to the nightmare. Furthermore, she added one final detail. My grandparents had also secretly established a separate, fully funded college trust, specifically for my education, containing $50,000, which, thanks to years of smart interest accrual, had now blossomed into over $58,000. I closed my eyes as a wave of overwhelming emotion washed over me, realizing that $50,000 was the exact same blood money figure my father and uncle had tried to use to buy my silence and cooperation. My grandparents had anticipated every single hurdle, planning out my future quietly, carefully, and with boundless love long before I even knew how to fight. That very week, I officially enrolled as a full-time student at Ridgemont Community College, majoring in environmental science with a specialized minor in forestry, positioning myself to protect the natural world just like Grandpa taught me. The cabin was only a short 20-minute drive from campus, and when I filled out my official college residency and administrative paperwork, I wrote down the cabin's physical address under my primary home address for the very first time in my life. And for the first time, it felt entirely, beautifully true. A few days later, I reached out to Mom and Dad, asking them to meet me at a neutral, quiet coffee shop downtown, somewhere calm where we could talk without the suffocating ghosts of our suburban house or the sacred walls of the cabin hanging over us. They looked visibly aged, nervous, and hollowed out when they walked through the glass doors and sat across from me in the booth. After we ordered our drinks, I took a deep breath and spoke first, telling them quietly that while I loved both of them deeply, the cabin was never, ever going to be put up for sale. Not now, and certainly not ever in the future. Mom immediately opened her mouth to launch into another defensive tirade, but I gently raised my hand to stop her in her tracks, reminding them of the harsh realities. You both actively threatened to throw me out onto the streets. You invaded my privacy by searching through my personal bags, and you relentlessly tried to pressure me into casually signing away a sacred legacy that Grandma trusted me to protect with my life. Dad stared down into the murky surface of his black coffee for a long, painful silence, finally whispering in a broken voice that he honestly didn't know how to fix the irreparable fracture between us. You don't have to figure out how to fix all of this today, I told him with calm maturity, standing up from the booth and grabbing my jacket. I will call you this coming Sunday to check in. It wasn't an instant magical forgiveness or a complete wiping away of the past, but it was at least a realistic, honest beginning. One sunny Sunday afternoon in May, my younger sister Chloe drove her car out to the cabin carrying a couple of hot pizzas, and we sat together out on the wooden porch watching a blue heron hunt near the shoreline. I didn't know the full extent of the terrible things they were plotting behind the scenes, she admitted softly while munching a slice, and I'm deeply sorry they tried to hurt you like that. I know you didn't, Kels, I reassured her, asking myself if she had been caught in the crossfire of our family war. You were just a kid, caught in the middle. We both were, I acknowledged gently, as she looked out across the sparkling water and remarked how breathtakingly peaceful it was here. Grandma used to say that exact phrase every single time she sat on this very porch, Chloe smiled softly, before asking hopefully if she would be allowed to come back and visit sometimes. Anytime you want, the doors are always open, I told her. We spent the rest of that lazy afternoon talking about college classes, the rotting wooden dock we needed to stain, and the local wildlife. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the heavy air in my chest lifted and things felt genuinely peaceful. Early one crisp morning in June, I sat completely alone on the front porch wrapped in a thick wool blanket with a steaming ceramic mug of coffee cradled between my hands, watching the thick morning mist float dreamily above the glassy surface of Cedar Lake, while the tall pine trees stood dark and majestic against the brilliant orange sunrise. I reflected deeply upon the chaotic, dramatic whirlwind of events that had brought me to this exact juncture in my life, realizing with absolute clarity that I hadn't truly won a war against my own family, because there is never any genuine victory or joy to be found in being betrayed by the very people who were supposed to shelter you from the storms of the world. But I had kept my sacred promise to the two people who loved me best, and for the absolute first time in my entire 18 years of existence, I was sitting firmly on solid ground that truly and indisputably belonged to me alone. Not because I happened to fight harder or yell louder than my greedy relatives, but because two brilliant visionary people loved me fiercely enough to prepare for the storms of the future long before I even knew how to look up at the sky.